Okay, I am Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. We've been trying to hold more in-person events for students this year, so this is our first Zoom session of the academic year. I urge everyone to sign up for our mailing list at YPSA, Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, if you aren't already signed up, because we have a bunch of other fascinating talks lined up, including our next one, which is a lecture by Professor Hillel Cohen on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that's going to be on November 13th on Zoom. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jonathan Laurence. Before I introduce him, just a word on how things will work. Professor Laurence will speak for about 40 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. You can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk, and I will ask them during the question period. The chat function is disabled. Now for the introduction. Jonathan Laurence is professor of political science at Boston College and director of I forgot to ask how it's pronounced. Is it Clough or Clough or Clough? Clough Center? No, Clough.
Clough Center.
Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. A specialist in comparative politics, Professor Laurence focuses on the intersection of politics and religion in Western Europe, Turkey, and North Africa. He's the co-author of Integrating Islam, Political and Religious Challenges in Contemporary France from 2006, and the author of Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, the State's Role in Minority Integration of 2012, and most recently, Coping with Defeat, Islam, Catholicism, and the Modern State of 2021, which was named the best book in religion and politics by the American Political Science Association. As a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution between 2008 and 2018, he addressed lawmakers on Capitol Hill, briefed diplomats, led a team of analysts at the State Department, and served on the Foreign Policy Committee of 2 presidential campaigns. His research and commentary on international affairs have been featured on CNN and in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications. His title today is Coping with Defeat, Islam, Catholicism, and the Modern State. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I am happy to present to you some outline of the book that I worked about 10 years on through a combination of fieldwork and archival research, thinking about the place of religion in contemporary societies and tracing backwards from a book that you mentioned I wrote called The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, which studied the creation of Islam councils in Western Europe over the past quarter century or so. And that was a research interest, obviously concerned with the place of Islam as a minority religion, and therefore integrating into majority Catholic, majority Protestant contexts. And of course, I found that the experience of Islam's integration or non-integration into these different state church systems depended very much on the country's majority's own experience with secularization, with the encounter with the state, especially in the course of the 19th century. And so this clued me into the deeper historical nature of what are, of course, contemporary concerns having to do with the compatibility of religion and politics, religion and democracy in particular, and Islam and democracy to be even more specific. I found that in order to understand the actors who were opening mosques and creating advocacy networks in Western Europe, it was necessary to trace them back to their origins, which in some cases was the countries of origin, immigrant sending countries who, in the post war period, helped fuel the post-war economic recovery of Western Europe by providing manual labor from North Africa and Turkey in particular. So, on the one hand, the people who were building prayer spaces and creating Islamic religious services were the sending countries' governments, who it turns out themselves have their own interesting history with secularization and the encounter with the state. And so I was determined to understand these dynamics because I thought that well, clearly the headlines and the experience, the sort of top level experience of Islam in Europe has been very conflictual, very controversial. But the more I learned about state Islam relations in North Africa and Turkey during my visits there, the more it reminded me of what I had learned about, say, the Italian experience separating from the Roman Catholic Church, or the French experience separating from the Roman Catholic Church, or the Spanish, or, one could go on and on. And so I realized that what was happening in the Muslim majority world, what had happened in the late 20th century, was very similar to what Europe had undergone in the late 19th century. And so, to carry the analogy one step further, I started to learn more about Catholics in the United States and Catholic immigrants to the United States, and the religious networks and prayer spaces and religious leadership and religious hierarchy that followed the arrival of Catholics in the United States, which of course was not an original feature of the American Republic. And the more I learned about that, the more it reminded me to come full circle of what we've all been hearing in the news about the experience of Islam in Europe for the last quarter century. So that is to say, the experience of American Catholics as a religious minority was highly conflictual, a source of great pessimism and alarm, a source of political violence and terrorism. And as I learned about the American responses, most, partly the U.S. government, but also partly the Roman Catholic Church as an actor centrally in Rome, but above all through its franchises, its representatives in North America, that there were in these responses a very interesting dynamic of domestication and adaptation as a religious minority, and that this feature of being an immigrant minority had the additional impact of reverse feedback upon the majority countries of origin. So the majority Catholic or the majority, I would later come to see majority Muslim countries of origin when comparing the American Catholic experience and its impact on the Catholic Church centrally in Rome and elsewhere, and the impact of European Islam and the experience of Muslim communities on the apparatuses of official religion in the majority Muslim countries of origin. So let me open up my PowerPoint to give you some more detail about the nature of my argument. I just would mention sort of one more more point before launching into that, which is, how does this relate to anti-Semitism? How does this relate to the question of relations with other religions, other religious minorities, Jews in particular? Well, the argument of the book, and it's a very big book, so it's hard to completely summarize here. So I invite you to explore it. But the argument of the book is that um, there's a process of political defeat, and that this has an impact on community relations, not only with the state but also with other religious communities. And that there is a moderating effect of the state-religion relationship that comes out of the reality that the modern state is hegemonic in terms of state-society relations, and is on the granting end of status and regulatory approval and permitting of that relationship. And that in the Catholic case, this has had a very interesting feedback through the mechanism of the Second Vatican Council, which I'll try to get into in a moment. And in the Muslim case, well, it's obviously still playing out. So, all right, let me. So the starting point of the book is, in a sense, to look at the public place of Roman Catholicism and Sunni Islam in particular in the public imagination, but also in the sort of explicit views expressed in the international media and elsewhere about democracy. And of course, right now we're at a point where we have a Roman Catholic Pope who is friendly to democracies, who speaks in the European Parliament and the United States Congress, and makes appeals for democracy and democratic values. And of course, on the other hand, there is a rather unresolved place of Islam in world politics, which most recently was kind of well summed up in the ISIS phenomenon, the Islamic State, of course, in Syria and Iraq, where a rogue caliphate was auto-proclaimed. And I argue in the book that you would actually, if you were looking at the international religious scene just around 150 years ago, that you would have actually predicted quite different outcomes for the Roman Catholic Church and for Sunni Islam. This is indicative, of course, of the changing nature of these things, but that, of course, undermines the idea that there is some intrinsic nature to these religions in terms of their political expression and interaction with the state, which the book, of course, tries to dismantle and show that there's actually a lot of adaptation that takes place. So 150 years ago, of course, it was the Ottoman Sultan Caliph who sought to make alliances with Western powers, courted royals and other empires and try to prove his Western bona fides. Whereas the Pope in Rome, Pius IX, of course, in the throes of the Italian unification, having been reduced vastly cut down to size through the various national movements, was condemning the Western powers, condemning the democracies, of course, condemning all that was modern. And so if you were to have guessed, where would things be? So if you were asked in 1875, 1880, where would things be in the year, 2010, 2020, you would have actually put these two characters in different, in opposite roles. And so it's curious, like how does this come to be? And I developed a rather elaborate argument, but which is very empirically supported, for the notion that that we are in the middle of cycles and processes that these religions share, and that shared experience is rooted in three major historical moments. And so the argument of the book is that three major defeats have interceded to essentially challenge the political claims and political ambitions, executive ambitions of these two religions. And that the first of these defeats came in the form of the loss of population and territory during their major period of what I call imperial retrenchment. In the case of the Roman Catholic Church, of course, it is the experience of the Reformation and the breaking off of the northern churches that is that leads to an adaptation to operate over international borders that I suggest is necessary in order to come to a peaceful settlement with the modern state. And I argued that something similar happened with regard to the end of the Ottoman Empire. So I compare the end of the Ottoman Empire essentially to the moment of Protestant Reformation, because similarly, you had national churches, essentially national Islams, that were taking the place of a transnational religion. And this took place during the course of the European takeover of North Africa and the Middle East, but also well beyond the South Asian subcontinent, the area of the world that become Java, Indonesia. So the losses that the Europeans inflicted upon the Sultan Caliph in Istanbul, I compare to the losses that the kings, who were the national heads of church in Norway and Sweden and various German and Swiss states and of course England and elsewhere, that these were essentially analogously troublesome to the central power in Rome and Istanbul, respectively, and that this marked the first major defeat, which led to the creation of a new kind of clergy that would have to operate, of course, over international borders, and they would have to operate under another law, right? Because it would no longer be in the majority. So just to move forward here, well, actually, let me okay. So that process, the way it looks for the Ottoman Empire, is here. You can see essentially this is a chart showing the loss of populations and the loss of important territories to Europeans, and that thick black line is the rate of spending that the various religious affairs ministries and directorates had deployed. And so the argument is that the more fellow believers are found beyond borders, beyond sovereignty, beyond the sovereignty of the religious authorities, the more they spend actually on professionalizing and institutionalizing their infrastructure and their educational institutions and their hierarchy. So those three aspects, and that the way that this happened in the Ottoman Empire was quite interesting and quite analogous actually to the way that it was taking place also during the Protestant Reformation. And so let me here just show you this table where you can see a little bit side by side what I mean. So the notion is that you have this professionalization taking place in the wake of three successive defeats. And so that first defeat, of course, is this Reformation and imperial retrenchment. The second defeat, which I will discuss only briefly, is the advent of the modern nation state in European cases in the 19th century, and of course in North Africa and the Muslim world, in Turkey in the course of the 20th century. And so the argument there is that the advent, of course, of national authorities, national governments, who take over directly the religious institutions. In Catholic Europe, it is direct control of the nominations of priests and bishops and cardinals and religious education, insofar as it's allowed to exist through the creation of new interior ministries and the like in the late 19th century. And of course, in the Muslim world, it is the creation of ministries of religious affairs. So that is the national, the analogy between the advent of the nation state in these two areas. And then the final one is the unexpected and voluntary mass migration of millions of Muslim guest workers from North Africa and Turkey towards Western Europe, and of course the unanticipated voluntary and mass migration of millions of Catholic men from all over Europe, of course, in between 1850 and 1920. And so the argument of the book is that each of these moments, and here just is a little chart where you can see the comparability of the migration trends, right? Where sort of I compare the Muslim migration to Europe with the Catholic migration to the United States, and show it as a percentage of the population in addition to its sort of absolute size. And so the argument is that in the wake of each of these major defeats, that you have these major moments of institution building, infrastructure, education, and hierarchy, and that with each successive defeat, there is a kind of accommodation of the rule of law, notwithstanding the intentions of the religious leadership, but just in order to exist and function. So let me show you a little bit more detail here about the process by which this took place. And there's a major aspect of this book which tries to explain the dysfunction within the religious organizations of Islam, that there's a certain amount of competition, fractured dissent, of course, that has led not only to Sunni Shia divisions, but extremely sharp intra-Sunni divisions, and I would argue that these continue to these are actually at the root of many of our contemporary conflicts, both internally in the domestic politics of the Middle East, but also in terms of the international relations of the Middle East. And so I try to unpack this and try to explain where I think things went wrong. And I actually I trace this to the gradual European takeover of the former Ottoman lands. And here you can see sort of how it gradually took place, getting to a point where the largest Muslim powers, in terms of absolute and relative numbers, were not within the Muslim world, but rather they were being governed in the Muslim world from afar, from the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, French Empire, Russian Empire, and one could go on, but that this experience had a highly disruptive impact on the development of the religion as a centrally organized one, capable of coming to the kind of settlement with the modern state that was starting to occur under the last Ottoman Sultan caliphs. And so how did this take place? Well, in part, the British and the French and the Dutch all conspired to essentially depose the Sultan Caliph, and of course to replace him in throughout the world, not only where he literally governed, such as in Arabia or in parts of the Balkans, but also where he was only a sort of figurative figurehead in places like Dutch Java or British India. And so, of course, the ultimate aim of the Europeans was to replace the Sultan Caliph with their own chosen Islamic leadership. And I argue in the book that this spectacularly backfires, whether you're talking about the Mufti of Jerusalem, which is a British invention, which spectacularly backfires within several years of its creation, or if you are talking about the decision to empower the Wahhabi Sauds as the governors of Mecca and Medina, which is, of course, the ultimate objective of the Western intervention, especially the British intervention, of course. This is complicated. It has to do with the commitment to securing trade routes through the Suez Canal. But of course, it also has to do with the fact that Britain is a colonial power with 80 million Muslim subjects living in British India, which of course comprises Pakistan and Bangladesh, and thus having tens of millions of believers under its rule, is concerned that the influence of the Ottoman Sultan might be used to declare holy war against the British, and thus create difficulties for them in their colonial lands. So, and while there was some truth to that, or some reason to indeed fear the worst, the reality was, in fact, quite different, because the way in which the Ottoman Sultan caliphs had in fact begun to project their power through the rise of pan-Islam was actually not a politically active form of the religion, but was in fact a kind of cultural overlay that was necessarily compatible with operating over international borders. And so this is obviously, very detailed, complex stuff. And so I get into the spending and the organization and the responses of the Ottomans to this European presence. The next sort of step in this process I mentioned as the period of nation state Islam, of course, with the advent of the nation state era and the end of the European empires. What had been governed centrally from Istanbul and then respectively from the different European capitals was suddenly in the mid to late 20th century governed by dozens of ministries of Islamic affairs. Which behaved in ways that were very similar to the interior ministries of Western Europe when they came to take control essentially over areas that had previously been the domain of religious authorities, but which were taken into state hands. And so I tried to show the growth of what I call nation state Islam over the course of the 20th century as being something. And here there's detail about Turkey, there's detail about Morocco, Algeria, other countries, where I try to show what it means for a state Islam to emerge in the 20th century, and how that impacts the religious authority and the political role of religious figures by subordinating them into the rule of law in much the same way that Catholic leaders were subordinated under the rule of law during the nation state era in Western Europe. So the next major phase that is of interest is the period of Catholic migration to North America, from Western Europe to North America. And I try to shed some new light on this experience by reminding ourselves of just what a conflictual arrival it was. This is, you can see that black thick line is the total U.S. Catholic population, and you can see it starts from virtually nothing, right? In the early 19th century, there simply were not Catholics, very many Catholics amongst the original settlers. There may be 25,000 or so at the start of the American Revolution. To the extent that the United States gained Catholics, it was through the acquisition of the Floridas and the Californias and the Louisiana Purchase and such, but those were still not important numbers. The great numbers you can see start to arrive if you look at that first peak on the graph in the mid-19th century. Irish and Germans, who are then, of course, joined by Hungarians, Italians, more Irish, and many other who are pouring out of Catholic Europe in very similar numbers and for similar reasons that Muslims eventually pour out of North Africa and Turkey into Western Europe, which is to say, in search of economic opportunity and in some cases in search of ideological freedom, because the late 19th century in Europe has a lot in common with the late 20th century Middle East in that it was highly politically repressive. It was liberal in the sense that the state was secularizing and it did not, it was illiberal in the sense that it did not tolerate religious activism. It sought to uproot the church really from public life. And of course, there were in the Catholic countries an extremely high number of anarchists in the late 19th, early 20th century. This was not a purely Catholic phenomenon. Obviously, there's a lot of important Protestant, Jewish, etc. anarchists, but if you look at where the major attacks were and where the major anarchists came from, it was Catholic Europe. And so I try to remind ourselves of the experience that American Catholics went through, and that the Catholic religion went through as a minority religion here. At first, really being quite oppositional to the rule of law, undermining, for example, the right to divorce by suggesting that there was a higher law that was truer, right, than this law. There's another way in which Catholics were painted and were in fact extremists. They joined international fighting forces, irregular militias that the Pope Pius IX called for, not unlike the Caliph al-Baghdadi when his caliphate was being overrun. The Pope, when the Papal States were being overrun, made an appeal to young Catholic men around the world, and tens of thousands answered their call, including, of course, many American Catholics, and including many veterans of the American Civil War, and not only from the South, although also from the South. And one of these actually would go on to become to be implicated in the assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln and other cabinet members in 1865. Catholics were, of course, seen as, and they were, vectors of religious conservatism at a time when the Pope was vehemently anti-democratic. And I mentioned that their association with anarchism, you had attacks in Paris, in Barcelona, and there was a very important anarchist intellectual life in the United States, which was allowed to thrive, not unlike the way that an Islamist intellectual life was allowed to thrive in Western Europe, because I mentioned that there was labor migration, mass migration to these two major destinations. But in addition to the labor migration, there was also political asylum. Right, there was a very important amount of political asylum that was granted to to anarchists, or who were simply not filtered out. And the same for Islamists fleeing repressive regimes in North Africa and Turkey. Sometimes they were being repressed for understandable reasons, but these were kind of unintelligible on the receiving side of Western Europe, who really saw this in simpler terms of freedom from oppressive regimes, much the way that American authorities understood anarchists fleeing Europe as freedom seekers. Right, this was the case up until there were two American Catholics, or Catholics from America, who were involved in the major assassinations of heads of state, first in Italy, in Monza in 1900, when a New Jersey Italian, he was a former prisoner in Italy who came to work and married an American, who went back and killed the King of Italy because of his repressive acts against the anarchists and against people. Really, I mean, it was a tough time. And then, of course, a Polish American, second generation, assassinates the American president in Buffalo, 1901. And so I argue in the book that this leads to a sort of very important process whereby the American government, and this is also for other reasons that have to do, right, in this year 1900, we had just acquired Puerto Rico, we had just we had influence in Cuba, Philippines, we had all of these new Catholic populations. So it was for a number of reasons, it was about time to kind of domesticate, to change the supply of the religious infrastructure, education, and hierarchy from descending countries of Western Europe to the new permanently Catholic minority, or permanent minority of Catholics in the United States. This is an example of the man who replaced McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, choosing as his interlocutor an Americanist cardinal. The church at the time, as you can imagine, was divided between those who sought absolute loyalty to Rome and those who sought out a role for the American church. as such, and who wanted the church to be have its own national hierarchy, right? Much in the way that France has a national hierarchy or Italy has a national hierarchy. But up until 1909, interestingly, the United States was simply treated as um, a member of the mission of the propaganda fide. So it was simply a missionary country. That is much the way that Europe has continued to be treated that Europe has continued to treat Islam, and Islam has been treated in Europe. But there's a moment in the United States where I try to show that essentially there is an attempt to increase the infrastructure, education, and hierarchy available, and to Americanize it. This takes place through the advent of a North American college in Rome, as well as the creation of American seminaries. There's the first American-born bishops and cardinals. And so anyway, I bring this forward all the way to the study of how this is unfolding in Western Europe. Of course, not similarly, it starts off very unpromisingly with foreign fighters and terrorism and segregation. But I try to show how, just like the Catholic authorities were forced to adapt in order to operate in the United States in the aftermath of movements of political violence, so to have the sending countries of Turkey and North Africa in particular adapted their own outreach such that it is now the subject of a sort of similar diplomacy. This is the French foreign minister and the Moroccan Islamic affairs minister. And so I try to show how in the course of the Western European Muslim experience that something similar happened. So I'm going to just skip to the end here and conclude by hinting to the sort of the bottom line here, which is that how do religions re-enter civil society after having gone through these experiences of banishment and control and high regulation, and I try to show that there are several important steps that took place in the Catholic context that had to do with that American experience of breaking off from the religious center. And I also highlight, of course, the creation of the Vatican State and explain where that the Vatican City fits in with this, since the overall concern here is with the depoliticization of religion for the everyday citizen, and of course the resolution of certain suspicions is impossible until there is kind of the resolution of the religion's status in the international order, as well as the religion status domestically as an established religious actor. So I try to show how the feedback mechanisms that develop after the immigrant experience have tended to favor kind of moderation. And in the American case, you have the feedback of American bishops and other hierarchs into the Second Vatican Council, which ultimately leads to an alleviation of Catholic attitudes towards Jews, which is, of course, still evolving. But you have the beginnings of religious tolerance that are finally extended in the last third of the 20th century, and I argue that this is very much because of the processes that I've described. And in the Muslim case, obviously, the process is still underway. There are a lot of reasons why these issues have not been solved. I don't think they're all intrinsic to Islamic actors, obviously, but I do think that they are subject to similar pressures that the Catholic actors and both domestically and internationally underwent. which led to a relatively fortuitous outcome, I would say. And so I remain hopeful, even in somewhat dark times, that when politics can resume and war is over, that some of these dynamics may resume. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I encourage everyone to submit questions using the Q&A function. And we're going to go until 5 o'clock, so we have a little bit of time. So that was just so interesting, I think, to hear about how central religion remains for all of the questions that we are interested in the program for the study of anti-Semitism. I mean, I think there's a tendency to abstract the political away from these religious questions and to think about, it's all about anti-Zionism now, but, there's a kind of religious dimension to all of this. So I'll start us off with a question that occurred to me. I work on France and specifically on Jews in France. And I'm curious about the extent to which you think that France's evolution towards a secular, like laïcité, a secular model for the state, was influenced by anti-Semitism and by debates over the Jewish community. Of course, what I'm thinking about specifically is the Dreyfus affair that in many ways provoked the official separation of churches and the state in France as a kind of punishing of the Catholic Church for being against Dreyfus. So I was wondering if you could comment on the role of Jews in France's evolution.
Yes, well, so definitely the Third Republic, is a moment when the Israelites, the sort of the patriotic, emancipated Jews of France found their place as what Birnbaum called the fous de la République, who were Republican patriots who served in government and as government ministers, notably Adolphe Crémieux, who was interior minister as well as serving as president of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And so these questions are related because two different tracks. There were essentially two different tracks unfolding at the same place. One was France as a colonial power in North Africa, and Crémieux was quite active, and of course he helped make the Jews of Algeria into pure, wholly French citizens. And that was also the kind of thing that did not exactly please the Catholic Church, since they still had a very religious understanding of who was French, and the same went for the other. So one sure way to show your Republican bona fides was to emancipate the Jews, because it would show that you were not in the thrall of the church. The 1905 law, I agree. It comes in the wake of the Dreyfus affair of the late 1890s, but it's the culmination of this back and forth between the revolution and then over the control of morality in 19th century France. And so this goes back and forth in between imperial times and when there's a quasi restoration of the role of the church. And so it's a fascinating moment at the end of the 19th century, however.
Great. So a question about and this is a big topic, but if you can say something about why certain states in the Middle East became secular, some kind of in explicit model, copying of the French model. I'm thinking of like Turkey, for instance, whereas others, have a state religion of Islam as the state religion. So is there a way to think about an easy way to think about like which states evolved in which way?
Well, so my view is that that there's state religion everywhere in the Muslim world, but that with the exception of Iran and Afghanistan, it's very much the state that appoints religious leaders and not the other way around.
Mhm.
And so Turkey looks secular, but in fact that's kind of a misnomer. It has had a state supported monopoly over religion for 75 years. The first
But for a while though, I mean, like under, um, Kamal, I mean, in the Kemalist era, it was more secular, right? Or no? Is it?
Well, so the Young Turks, who sort of the revolutionaries who led to the ultimate declaration of independent Turkey, and the end of the Ottoman Empire, had come of age in Third Republic France, and they studied in Third Republic France. And the Tanzimat reforms of the previous generation had basically folded in, the Swiss Constitution of 1848. So there were all sorts of kind of Europeanizing tendencies within the Ottoman Empire that were leading to the sort of Turkish nationalist emergence. And of course, in opposition to that was the old regime, which was the Sultan Caliphs. So perforce there was that conflict, and the first thing that Ataturk did, and that the nationalist Republicans did, was do away with the religion. I mean, there were 25 years from 1925 to 1950 where there weren't enough mosques, there was no imams, nothing. But after that, basically all of the governments of Turkey, including the most secularist, the most Kemalist, did invest heavily in the religion, mostly as a way to avoid that field being taken over by Saudi extremists or later Iranian Shia allies.
And given that, again, this is a program to study anti-Semitism, I was wondering, I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on whether what differences there are in the Middle Eastern states in attitudes towards Jews, let's say after 1948, and whether that correlates to the type of relationship between the state and religion.
Well, it's not a pretty picture. The so the I alluded to the colonial experience itself as being very divisive, right? So Jews and Muslims lived kind of happily, not ideally, not utopically.
I mean, Jews were always second-class citizens, right? Yeah.
They were dhimmis, they were people of the book, but compared to the medieval Jew in Europe, I think
Right.
I
It
know
was
which
better. Yeah.
Jews. Well, it's quantitatively and qualitatively better, right?
Mhm.
There would never have been an industrial genocide in the Arab world of the Jews, right? There was never that track of the Enlightenment thought. Let's put it that way. So yes, second class, but existing and allowed religious freedom. So what messes this up? Well, what messes this up is the European takeover of Islam from this kind of moderate understanding of things. They essentially promoted the Wahhabi Sauds as the main guarantors of the religion for extraordinarily cynical reasons, for purely short-sighted, self-interested reasons. And the effect of that is to have chosen the most puritanical, modern, literalist interpretation of religion, which is a reaction, to the kind of moderation that I was describing. And this is entirely the doing of the British and the French, and it was done on purpose. So that's where things started to go wrong. And then, of course, the understanding of the advent of the state of Israel, I think there's been a misunderstanding of it in almost the entire Muslim world as some kind of continuation of the European imperial project, and the kind of the misassignment of responsibility for the Holocaust. Right. And so that's almost universal, right? I mean, I can't think of a Muslim country that doesn't apply to. So there's not, it's not a pretty picture, but I think of this as, resolvable, because it really is a matter of finding legitimate authorities within the Muslim world, which once existed and which can exist again, who are in a position to show what, how you actually function as a world religion, right? Not as a kind of ideal, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could follow our religion perfectly? Like, just all of these religions have come to basic compromises with the reality of the new political order. And Islam was stymied, and in that, because of foreign intervention, in the governance of the Muslim world. And so, the way that Jews are treated, I mean, right now you can sort of have a little bit of Jewish life in Morocco or Turkey, I guess. You can't, I mean, there are Tunisian Jews, sure, but I wouldn't really want to do that. Algeria, there's not any anymore, but that's not their fault. It's it's the French's fault, frankly. And so, it's complicated, but the reasons for it, I think, are quite, are maybe not what we would intuitively think.
And okay, because we're basically out of time, but you do hold out some hope for an evolution in thinking around these questions. I mean, it seems like we're so far from anything good happening around it, but you seem a little bit hopeful, so I want to hear why.
Well, yeah, well, because I mean, there's been enormous pessimism around, many of these areas, and you know, things were actually, so in September of 2023, we were on the verge of some kind of major moment of compromise, with the custodians of Islam, right? From Jerusalem to Mecca to Medina. I mean, this is important. Um, and the fact that only revolutionary Iran, it can, sort of assert itself as a legitimate anti-system force, is the result of all sorts of dysfunction that have nothing to do with, whether or not Muslims and Jews can get along. And so I think that if you resolve the geopolitical issues, you take away the fuel for the hatred, which, of course, you could fuel hatred between any kinds of groups. Honestly, this is an extreme case where it's very easy to pour fuel on it. But if you resolve the basic issues, which is to say that Jerusalem has to have some bit of Muslim sovereignty, it has to have some bit of Jewish sovereignty, and that the Sauds can't have the monopoly over Mecca and Medina, they're going to have to share it. Like, that's the way Islam works. It's an ummah. So if you resolve these questions, which might take 50 years, that there's no reason to think that we don't have an outcome like the Vatican City, right? Where, of course, it might be strange to be a Jewish minority in some Catholic countries still, but you can be one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much. This was really a perspective that we, haven't gotten in all the talks we've given, and we're really grateful to you. So I urge everyone to buy the book, and you'll get a much more detailed explanation there. So thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining. And I'll see you at our next event. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Bye.